All right, Shalom. First off, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shah, Bahashem, Rakakadash. I want to give double honors to the apostles, bishops, and elders of Great Millstone. And that's a sincere Shalom to the Akim out here that's doing it and pushing this work in truth and in sincerity. Want to go on this video about a dream that I just had about fighting for respect or truth, I should say, against, two younger brothers. Okay. It was, in my dream, and I put it right here. And I had a dream about meeting two younger brothers in Great Millstone and tried to greet them. And it was in a, I noticed I went to another state in this dream. Okay. And, I had, seen two younger brothers, whether it was before camp or after camp. I think it probably would have been after, but it was a pretty large camp. Okay. And I seen them, in a restaurant. Okay. Standing in line. Okay, and I noticed the brothers, but they didn't notice me. Okay, they didn't know who I was. Okay, pretty much I knew who they were because I seen seen them on videos or whatever, But when they saw me, they didn't know who I was. I just looked like a random guy to them. Okay. So it says, I tried to greet them happily, but one of them called me out my name and tried to rebuke me because they didn't know me and said I wasn't following the law. Okay. And, in the dream, it was like, they was trying to get on me about my hair, like your hair is longer than, which I don't have no hair. But it was just something so simple, like that, well, your hair is longer, than what it should be, and I didn't. It says I didn't take too well to the comment, in the dream, calling me out my name or whatever, and but some camps, they like that, they use certain, words as, terms of endearment, so you don't get too caught up in that, but some uh what's it like Baltimore, which we don't we don't call people dummies, and when we're trying to meet them, or saying hi to somebody. People in Baltimore do that, but brothers in the faith, we don't call each other dummies, okay, and we don't call others dummies as well. So that language isn't in our camp, okay. So it says, I didn't take too well to the comment in the dream, and they went into a back and forth about scripture, history, with both of them, as if I was fighting for respect. But as the conversation dream kept going on, I started reflecting on where I could be wrong. Okay, especially in a situation like that, where it's 1 versus 2. Okay, especially in a restaurant with unbelievers. Okay, it says in the Bible, says 2 or more witnesses, and it's my word against theirs. Okay, and hey, every brother's been in that situation before, where it could be your word against somebody else, but in this dream of me talking to them, okay, it just was a thing of correction, okay, from the get-go. Okay, and it was that's not even um, how I, even get down or try to approach, situations, as far as, when it's with brothers, you don't want to get into, back and forths. But hey, sometimes that's how it goes. Okay. Um, but in that situation of, somebody trying to correct me on something, you know, uh, as far as, that they thought that I was guilty of, but, I wasn't, and then, the fact that they didn't know me, you know, kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Okay. And, uh, you know, that's where the respect thing comes in, because some people, some younger brothers don't understand the respect, when it comes down to older brothers that's been in this faith, um, I would, dare to call myself an elder. I've been pushing this work for a minute. Other brothers call me an elder, in this faith, but I'm not, a top elder. Okay, I'm just a brother, in the truth that's trying to fight for his faith. Okay, so it says, dreams like that can hit hard because they usually tap into deeper fears, tensions, or convictions already sitting in your mind. In your case, the dream seems less about winning an argument and more about authority, recognition, correction, pride, and self-examination. It says a few things stand out. You approach them peacefully and happily. They immediately questioned or rebuked you. Your first reaction was defending yourself, which really was, what the scriptures say, and fighting for respect. Okay. But later in the dream, reflection and self-examination started creeping in, and it was like a thing of like, from their perspective, from when I looked at it, like we don't care who you are, which, yeah, the scriptures talk about no respect of persons. Okay. But that goes to a certain extent. Okay. With certain people. Okay. Because if they knew who you were, then they would be, they would let it fly. Okay. Some Jake, they don't understand that. They got to know you in order for them to, get the respecting you. Okay. And, that's not the mindset that a person should have. Okay. If you bring in that, IUIC spirit in this faith. Okay. Because you don't know this person, you got to rebuke them on certain laws, and who they are, questioning who they are, which is no problem with questioning, who they are, trying the spirit and everything like that. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, but when you sit up there and you have this mindset that, well, I don't know this person, they're not a familiar face, a person that I've seen, okay, or know or learned, okay, that I can just correct this person, especially about a law, okay, that to me comes off as, an IUIC type of spirit, okay, because we're not saved by the law, okay. But it says that progression matters, right? Because, it says from a biblical perspective, there's a balance between not accepting false accusation blindly and still being humble enough to examine yourself. Okay, even scriptures about 2 or 3 witnesses are usually about establishing a matter carefully, not automatically meaning the majority is always right. One person can still be correct against 2 people. The prophets often stood alone. Jeremiah, Elijah, and even Yahweh stood against groups at times. At the same time, the dream may be exposing something deeper, the desire to be acknowledged, sensitivity to disrespect, concern about being seen as off, or anxiety about whether you're truly walking correctly. Okay, and I'll be honest, man. I'm extremely anxious about walking on eggshells in this truth. Because I don't want the Lord Yahweh Shah to, you might go through something and you go back, and look at it, But it says the fact that you started reflecting instead of staying defensive the entire dream is automatically important. Biblically, self-examination is considered wisdom. Examine yourselves, whether you be in the faith. Okay, you don't want to be, looked at like a reprobate. Okay. It says not every rebuke is righteous, but not every rebuke should instantly be rejected either. And I agree with that. Okay. It says another layer is that dreams often dramatize internal tensions. You've been thinking a lot about doctrine, discernment, authority, Christianity, GMS teachings, and people claiming spiritual understanding. Your mind may be processing, how do I know when correction is valid? Am I defending truth or ego? How do I respond when people come at me harshly? Does disagreement automatically means someone lacks the spirit? Okay. And it says your earlier thought trying the spirit by the spirit can look like a pissing contest actually connects to this dream strongly. Sometimes people believe they are defending righteousness, but the indirection turns into a battle over status, knowledge, or dominance instead of edification. One thing worth considering in the dream, the turning point wasn't necessarily them proving you wrong. It was you becoming willing to reflect. That's different. That kind of humility is important because scripture repeatedly warns about being wise in your own eyes, desiring preeminence, or hardening yourself against correction. And let's get that word preeminence. Okay, surpassing all others, very distinguished in some way. Okay, to be outstanding, supreme, or better than all others in a specific field or specialty. Okay, it describes someone or something that rises above the rest or holding the highest rank or authority. And, I don't have that mindset, yeah, I would want, respect. Okay, but, in certain situations, you're not going to get, the respect that you want. Okay, so, when we go back into it, okay, it says desiring authority, which that's preeminence, or trying to surpass other people, and in this truth, it's not a thing of this, compared to this person knowing that, the Lord, yes, we're supposed to know the doctrine, okay, but honestly, it's all supposed to go into faith, and works, okay. It ain't about your status, okay. If you are of the elect, there's nothing that you can do to change that, okay. That's a status that the Lord has given you that we haven't received that yet, okay. We can have all of the names, the titles, and all that stuff on this side, but you can do all that stuff and still not be of the elect. You can still not be a man of the Lord. We've seen people who had the title of elder, the title of first in command, okay, that ended up falling out this truth, okay. So it's not about having a status or even a knowledge, okay, of the scriptures, that surpasses everybody, which, that's what I perceive, and I'm not going to, because I wouldn't just sit up here and say, "Oh, I got into it with, younger brothers, and these young guys are just completely off," because clearly they knew, some things in the scriptures, but they didn't know uh, the I don't know how to the right mindset, because being young in the truth, you gotta go through some experiences, you know. Um, you can't just lean on your own understanding, okay? At every moment, you trying to just rebuke everybody, you turn into a rebukinator. That's a dangerous mindset to be in, because you gotta know when to rebuke, somebody, and if you going off, in that rebuke, okay? Just like in my situation, of when to stand up for yourself and when not, when is it getting too much, you know. So it says, but it also warns against false judges, hypocrites, and people who weaponize the law without mercy or understanding. That's the real point right there from what I've seen. IUIC, they weaponize, certain, well, even some guys in the truth, some guys are great millstone, you weaponize the law, okay, without no mercy or understanding. And certain things, man, it's like, yeah, people are supposed to, if a brother follows the law, right, you claim to be an Israelite or claim to be an Israelite, which, no, we're not saved by the deeds and the law, okay? That's just, like, you don't, knowing that we not supposed to eat pork, crabs, and shrimp, right? Certain things like that. We know that, that's like a common, understanding. But then some people will be like, well, why you ordering that? And why you especially if it's a restaurant, you know, somebody would be like, man, why you ordering that? You got this or that or whatever, you got the additives, and to be honest, we eating our food defiled among the heathen. Okay. Now, if a brother just going to a restaurant and he just ordering fucking pork, pork chop bacon covered with bacon, and be like, hold on, bro, how you claiming to be an Israelite? You doing something like that? that would be some extremely rebuking type shit. You call up, bro, like, take a video, a picture of this shit, man. Like, what the fuck is you doing? Yeah, I'm just, speaking extreme, on that, but weaponizing the law without mercy or understanding, and not understanding the laws, not that certain people just getting away with the law, with breaking laws, because we're covered by grace, okay. Like I said, if you have the elect, ain't nothing that you can do to change that, and there ain't nothing that you will want to do to change that, okay? It says, so the healthiest takeaway probably isn't, they were definitely right, or I was definitely right. It may be, I should be teachable without becoming spiritually bullied, or stay teachable without becoming spiritually bullied, right? And that's how I had that mindset, but some people out here, man, they ready to get on Jake, every moment that they can. Okay. It says, I shouldn't let pride control my reaction to correction. Not every disagreement is persecution. Truth should be able to withstand examination. And honestly, the emotional core of the dream sounds like it revolved around respect and legitimacy as much as doctrine itself. Sometimes dreams expose where our identity is tied to being recognized as knowledgeable, righteous, or spiritually sound. Okay? And, just because you know a law, right? You know the laws, statutes, commandments, and the scriptures don't mean that you understand the doctrine. Okay? Let's get that word doctrine. Okay? Because you could be just spewing out, certain things. Okay? But you got to be able to put all of this stuff together. You got to be able to put all of it together. Okay? It says a belief or set of beliefs held or taught by a church, political party, or other group. Okay. It says derived from the Latin word for teaching. It serves as an overarching framework of rules or theory. Okay. It says the term spans over several key areas. Religion, a codification of beliefs or dogma that a faith community follows, right? Laws or the law, it says principles or rules established through a history of past judicial decisions rather than written statuses. The doctrine of fair use, right? Yeah, religion and laws, right? Knowing the truth, it's only one truth, okay? We're not saved by the law, okay? That's one of the things that, IUIC goes off on, okay? So, continuing on, it says, looking back at the dream, I also realized that trying by the Spirit can sometimes turn into a pissing contest instead of sincere understanding. What started as a disagreement about scripture and law felt more like a fight for respect or an authority. As the dream kept going, I started reflecting on whether I was defending truth, defending pride, or reacting emotionally because it was two against one. It made me think about how spiritual discussions can shift from discernment into ego, where people focusing more on proving themselves right, dominant, or more spiritual rather than actually seeking understanding and correction. And, from that situation, now, like I said, I'm not going to just sit up here and say, because somebody corrects me, that they automatically in the right. You're in the right spirit for correcting. Okay. You just got to know the right time to correct. Okay. Or whether you are correct when correcting. Okay. And that's twofold in itself right there. Whether you are, correct. Okay. When correcting. Okay. Or whether you are, being, saying the right things, in the right spirit, okay? When you're trying to correct somebody about whether they're in the right spirit or not, okay? So, as they approach me or as, as I'm trying to greet them, and, they call me out my name and, saying certain laws, right? Immediately, it's like, it was like off-putting almost, okay? To, I'm like, you know what that means? Like, why you trying to correct me on that? And do you even know what that scripture is talking about? It got to the point where, it both of them going back and forth, like, man, you going this, you doing this, you doing that. To it was like whether it was ego on their part or ego on my part, and I'm like, I'm just trying to, break down what it means, how we supposed to be in that mindset, when it comes down to certain things. Not making an excuse, but just uh the right mindset to be in when it comes down to certain situations. Okay, so it says that's pretty mature reflection, because you move beyond just who won the argument and started examining the spirit behind the interaction itself. A lot of spiritual debates begin with the stated goal of seeking truth, but once pride, embarrassment, disrespect, or group dynamics enter the picture, the conversation can quickly shift into defending identity, protecting status, proving knowledge, or resisting humiliation, especially in environments centered heavily around doctrine, law, breakdowns, history, or authority. People can start equating being corrected with weakness or winning the exchange with righteousness. But scripture often separates wisdom from mere argumentation. A person can know verses, history, and technicalities and still operate with arrogance, wrath, envy, or strife. And that's what I was pretty much trying to say. Just because you know something don't mean that you're not operating in the right spirit. Okay? Just because you're trying to correct somebody don't mean that you're not being correct about how you're going about it. Okay? It says you also touched on something psychologically real. 2 against 1 changes the emotional atmosphere. Even if nobody is physically threatening you, being outnumbered can trigger defensiveness, pressure to hold your ground, fear of looking foolish, or strong emotional attachment to your position. That can make it harder to calmly evaluate whether you're standing truly on principle, partially wrong, misunderstood, or simply reacting emotionally to being challenged publicly, right? And honestly, your realization about trying the spirit by the spirit is important because discernment is supposed to uncover truth, not become a hierarchy contest. Okay, and that's not the mindset that I have. I got a certain status, or I've been pushing this truth for a certain amount of years that younger brothers can't tell me nothing. Okay, or I can't walk better, or be better. Because there's always room for improvement. Okay. It says there's a difference between testing doctrine sincerely and trying to establish spiritual dominance. The first seeks clarity. The second seeks superiority. Okay. And in that dream, I was, in my perception, testing, doctrine sincerely. But it was like, nah, you going off, and it was like, oh man, like you caught, in a log jam. It says sometimes the signs that a discussion has shifted into ego are when listening stops, people only wait for their turn to speak, humility disappears, and that's what this is what was going on, man. And from their perspective, from what I've seen, I should say, I'm sitting up here, I asked the question, and it was just like, yeah, they weren't even trying to listen. You just saw that this person didn't what's the word? You didn't approve of something, even though you was wrong for calling somebody out their name. Okay, that was greeting. What scriptures talk about. How enemies are. So you're supposed to be on your P's and Q's and stuff like that. You don't know whether this person is a agent. Okay, what type of spirit that they coming in. So you're supposed to look at that stuff, like you're supposed to look at things like that, especially if you don't know somebody. How you claiming to be in Great Millstone and you doing that? Or you got that mindset. Yeah, you would look at that. You would note it in your mind. Some people are more outspoken than others, But sometimes you got to be able to look at the situation. If a brother is saying that, he's in Great Millstone, been pushing to work for a while, um, you don't know this person, but then you call them out their name, rebuking them. You look at the situation, okay? You don't know whether this person is an agent, whether he's of the elect, right? But you shouldn't be looking at, brothers, especially if you know them, right? As if they aren't of the elect, we say we have the hope for elect, okay? But looking at somebody that you don't know and just automatically treating them like, like I ain't trying to hear nothing that you're saying, okay? Especially when it comes down to the doctrine, okay? People only waiting for their turn to speak, and it wasn't even a thing of, waiting for the turn to speak. It's, some people cut people off in the middle of their speech, okay? To try to shut people down, It says humility disappears, okay? And no humility. Correction becomes performative, or the goal becomes checking someone rather than building understanding. Okay, one of the hardest spiritual disciplines is being able to ask, what if I'm partially wrong, without collapsing into insecurity, and also, what if they're wrong without being proudful? Okay, that balance is difficult. Another important thing is reflection itself is not weakness. A lot of people double down emotionally because it says admitting uncertainty feels threatening to their image, but the willingness to examine your motives, whether pride, insecurity, anger, or sincerity, is often healthier than blind certainty. Your dream seems less like a message that you lost and more like an exposure of the tension between conviction, ego, respect, correction, and emotional reaction. That's a deeper lesson than simply winning a doctrinal exchange. Okay. Now let me get some scriptures. Okay. 1 Corinthians 2:1, it says, "And I, brethren, when I came to you, came not with excellency of speech or of wisdom, declaring unto you the testimony of Yahweh Shah." Okay? So, I'm not going to sit up here and, make it seem like I'm the most superior guy, like I know everything, I'm an eloquent speaker, okay? But I do know, that when it comes to, being saved, delivered, having some type of respect and status, on this side, we're not really going to get that much, okay? When you get that, crown on your head from Yahweh Shah, that's what really matters, So you could be somebody who rebukes or get rebuked and all that stuff. We all trying to fight for our salvation. Okay, you fighting for your respect for Yahweh Shah. Okay, and I'm not talking about against other brothers. Okay, because another brother can hate you. Okay, couple brothers can hate you. Okay, even brothers who might greet you, every day, they just don't like you. Okay, and if they don't respect you, I would dare say they would probably find themselves out if they don't respect other brothers that's in this truth. You can't just be a freaking hyena, ready to just go at, other people. Okay. And we've seen that, mindset, in the truth, and some people, they find themselves not in the truth anymore when they got that mindset. Okay. So it says, for I determined not to know anything among you save Yahweh Shah and him crucified. Okay. It says in the Amplified, for I made the decision to know nothing, that is to forego philosophical or theological discussions regarding inconsequential things and opinions while among you, except Yahweh Shah and him crucified, in the meaning of his redemptive substantiary death and his resurrection. All right, and let's look at that inconsequential. Not important or significant. Okay? Of no significance, irrelevant, illogical. Okay? So, certain things that, some Jake, go into, okay, that it's like, okay, yeah, that may be a law. Just for example, I wear your border of blue. We're not supposed to wear a border of blue every day, all the time. Okay, you in a hot the restaurant wearing your border of blue. Okay, we don't have that mindset. That's, like I said, that's what these other camps do, man. You see they got a shirt fringe on, you say, hey, what's me, shalom, or you try to say, speak to them, right? And then they automatically be like, you know what, where your shirt fringes at? Why you don't got your phylacteries on? And that's the theme of what that the dream I had. You getting on somebody about not having a border of blue, or do you think that they're not keeping a law, okay, that you're not saved from? Okay, what are the consequences of that? Okay. Oh, you're not an Israelite. How can you claim to be, in Great Millstone, and you looking like that? Like, yeah, that's not the mindset. Now, we don't have surf fringes in Great Millstone. That's not, the doctrine that we teach. Okay? But that's that mindset that, other Jakes have when it comes down to, the borders of blue and stuff like that, wearing a hat, not wearing a hat, as long as you ain't prophesying with your head covered, that's a problem. That's not a problem, I should say. Okay? It says, and I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. It says, and my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of Yahweh Shah. Okay, let me get one more. Okay, 1 Corinthians 6:1. Dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unjust and not before the saints? Okay. And that's also, if a brother, just say he owe a couple of dollars to another brother, okay, you're going to go to Esau's court system, to try to get some type of restitution. Okay. Right. It says, go to law before the unjust and not before the saints. Do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Right? And judgment is not just, putting your foot down, ready to, condemn somebody. Okay, it's mercy, understanding that comes along with, judgment. Okay? With small matters like that. Okay? Know ye not that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? If then you have judgments of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are least esteemed in the church. It says, I speak to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you? No, not one that shall be able to judge between his brethren. But brother goes to law with brother, and that before unbelievers. Right? It says, now therefore, and especially if it's a public situation, some people could be, trying to prove themselves right in front of, people that don't even know this truth, and they would be like, yup, that's how IUIC be, they try to put, Jake on blast about certain things in front of unbelievers and stuff like that, to try to, and let's say it's a group of women, they'll try to cater to that woman's feelings, and they don't even know the woman, I don't know if they trying to, shoot their shot or trying to get with the woman, but, yeah, that's how some Jake are. They got some type of status and they want to feel as though that they're right. And they feel like they are right because other people that don't know this truth will say that they're right. Yeah, you're right. Like, come on now. That's not becoming, okay, of what a man of the Lord should be, the mindset that he's supposed to be in. Okay? Give a damn about whether somebody else out here, who don't know this truth, sitting up here saying that we right or wrong. Okay? But they'll have their opinion. Okay? But it says, now therefore there is utterly a fault among you, because you go to the law one with another. Why do you not rather take wrong? Why do you not rather suffer yourselves to be defrauded? And that's one of the reasons, one of the things that I looked at, in the dream, of, why can't I just, accept it, if they saying that I'm wrong, just take it, You don't have to, say, oh, the doctrine and, or try to fight for some type of thing because you're not known, they don't know you and stuff like that, and that's cool, but, trying to fight for respect and, some type of, way here, I don't have no interest in that, man, trying to, win arguments, that's that. I don't want no part of that. Okay. I'm trying to, win Yahweh Shah. Okay. So with that, Lord willing, this is edifying. I want to say Shalom until next time.